The winter didn't knock. It came screaming out of the mountains, turning a forgotten ranch into a trap of wind, ice, and silence. A lone cowboy stood between two buildings, knowing that one wrong step in the storm could cost a life, not just his own, but the old horse depending on him, and the stray dog that had chosen him as its last hope. He had lost his family once before. This time, the land itself demanded an answer. What happens next will make you believe in quiet miracles and second chances for the forgotten. Before we begin, tell me where you are watching from. Drop your country in the comments below. If you believe no child or animal should ever face fear alone, hit subscribe now and share this story with someone who needs hope. Missoula, Montana carried winter without apology. The city sat low between mountains that trapped cold the way a basin holds water. And when the wind came down from the peaks, it didn't rush, it pressed. That morning, the Clark Fork River moved dark and slow, its surface dulled by thin ice that cracked softly along the edges. Snow from the night before lay uneven on sidewalks and truck beds, not enough to be beautiful, just enough to be inconvenient. The sky was a flat, metallic gray, the kind that erased shadows and made everything feel closer and heavier at the same time. Rhett Calder had lived in that weather long enough to stop noticing it, the way you stop noticing a bad knee until it flares. He was 33, solidly built, broad through the shoulders, with the compact strength of someone who spent his days lifting, pulling, fixing. His face was angular, weathered without being old, cheekbones sharp, nose straight but slightly off-center from a break years back. A short beard sat unevenly along his jaw, more neglect than style, and his dark hair curled stubbornly at the edges of his cap. His eyes were a pale gray blue, steady and observant, rarely betraying much beyond mild irritation or dry amusement. People around Missoula called him a cowboy, and he didn't correct them. He could ride, rope, and work cattle, but what defined him more was reliability. Rhett was the man people called when a gate sagged, when a fence line went down under snow, when something needed to be held together through one more season. He didn't talk much, didn't ask many questions, and didn't linger once the job was done. He had learned early that motion kept certain thoughts at bay. That lesson had been taught by loss. His father had died when Rhett was 17, thrown from a horse on black ice during an early thaw. There had been no drama to it, no long goodbye. One moment his father was there, solid and unremarkable, and the next there was a gap that never. Fully closed, Rhett's mother had retreated inward after that, not breaking, just thinning out, as if some essential density had drained away. His older brother Cody had taken the opposite path, becoming louder, warmer, filling rooms with music and jokes as if sound itself could brace the walls. Rhett, meanwhile, learned to be useful. He fixed things. He stayed quiet. He didn't expect much. On the morning Cody died, Rhett was behind O'Malley's diner, tightening a tarp over the bed of his pickup. The wind worried at the canvas, snapping it against the metal rails, and Rhett leaned his weight into the straps until they held. His phone rang in his jacket pocket, the vibration muted by layers of denim and flannel. He ignored it at first, finishing the knot the way he always did, slow, deliberate, exact. When it rang again, he stopped. The number wasn't familiar. He wiped his hands on his jeans before answering, a small, unconscious gesture. Calder. Rhett. Calder? The voice on the other end was male, careful, practiced in delivering information that changed people's lives. This is Rhett. This is Sheriff Latham. I'm calling about your brother, Cody. The wind pushed hard against Rhett's back. Somewhere nearby, a truck door slammed. The world kept its rhythm. What about him? Rhett asked. There was a pause, brief but loaded. There was an accident this morning at the North Fork site. Electrical work. Cody collapsed. EMTs responded immediately. Rhett watched a loose corner of tarp flap and twist. He tightened his grip on the phone. They couldn't revive him, the sheriff said. I'm sorry. The sentence landed without sound. Rhett felt it register somewhere distant, like a blow absorbed through layers of padding. He waited for the rest, some correction, some detail that would turn the words into something else. But there was nothing. I'll need you to come by the station, Latham continued, his tone softening. We have his personal effects. I'll be there, Rhett said. His voice sounded normal. That surprised him. He ended the call and stood still, phone in his hand, the cold seeping through his boots. He didn't sit down or lean against the truck. He didn't swear. He simply stood, breathing evenly, as if the next action might reveal what he was supposed to feel. At the sheriff's office, the air smelled faintly of disinfectant and burnt coffee. Sheriff Latham was a thick-set man in his late 50s with a gray mustache and a lined face that suggested long familiarity with hard news. He wore his uniform comfortably, like a piece of equipment he trusted. When he shook Rhett's hand, his grip was firm and lingering, a silent acknowledgement. "I'm sorry," Latham said again. Rhett nodded once. They sat in a small room with a folding table. On it lay a clear plastic bag holding Cody's belongings, a wallet worn soft at the edges, a ring, of keys, a battered pocket knife, and a silver ring. The ring was wide and scratched, plain except for the initials engraved inside, CC. "That ring was on him," Latham said. "Figured you'd want it." Rhett picked it up. The metal was cold, heavier than he expected. He turned it once in his fingers and then set it back down carefully. "There was also this," Latham added, sliding a folded piece of paper across the table. "Not official. It was in his jacket." Rhett unfolded it. The handwriting was unmistakable, bold, slanted, impatient, like Cody had written it mid-thought. "Rhett, if you're reading this, I'm not coming back. Don't let that freeze you. There's a box in my saddle gear, the one you always called junk. Look inside the pouch, do what it says, and take care of Juniper. She's old, but she knows more than either of us." Rhett exhaled through his nose, a sound that might have been a laugh if it had lasted longer. Cody, managing one last instruction, one last joke. Rhett folded the note and slipped it into his pocket. "Juniper?" Latham asked. "Our horse," Rhett said. "Dad's." Latham nodded. "You got someone with you today?" Rhett considered the question and shook his head. "I'm fine." Latham didn't challenge him. He had learned when to let men lie to themselves. Rhett drove straight to the fairgrounds lot on the edge of town. The place was quiet, the air heavy with the smells of hay, manure, and old wood. Juniper stood in her stall, a dapple gray mare with a long, intelligent face and dark eyes dulled slightly by age. Her back dipped more than it used to, and her movements were slower, but there was nothing fragile about her presence. She watched Rhett approach, ears flicking forward. When he opened the stall door, she stepped closer and pressed her muzzle into his chest, breathing warm air through her nostrils. Rhett rested his forehead briefly against hers. "Hey," he said, quietly. Outside the stall, Cody's saddle gear hung from a rail under a canvas cover. Rhett lifted it down, the leather stiff with cold and use. He found the crate Cody had always refused to throw away, filled with mismatched straps, broken buckles, odd scraps of tack that only Cody believed still had purpose. At the bottom sat a small leather pouch. Rhett loosened the drawstring and reached inside. His fingers closed around an envelope, thicker than it should have been. The paper was yellowed, the edges worn smooth by time. There was no return address, just his name, written in dark ink, steady and unfamiliar. For a long moment, Rhett didn't open it. The barn was quiet except for Juniper shifting her weight behind him. The wind rattled the siding softly. The envelope felt heavier than paper had any right to be. Rhett slid it into the inside pocket of his jacket, close to his chest. He didn't know what Cody had set in motion, only that his brother had not left things unfinished by accident. Outside, Missoula's winter pressed on, unchanged. Inside the barn, with an old horse breathing steadily at his back and a sealed letter warming slowly against his ribs, Rhett Calder understood that whatever came next would not allow him to remain where he was. Rhett didn't open the envelope that night. He drove home from the fairgrounds with Juniper loaded into the trailer, the mare calm in the way old animals often were when change hovered nearby. Snow began again before he reached the edge of town, thin and dry, the kind that hissed against the windshield and vanished on contact. His small house sat on the outskirts of Missoula, a low structure with a sagging porch and a single yard light that flickered when the wind pressed too hard. It had never been much, but it had always been enough. Tonight it felt hollow, like a place that had already started letting go of him. Inside, the heat kicked on with a tired groan. Rhett hung his jacket by the door, feeling the unfamiliar weight of the envelope settle against his ribs before he took it out and set it on the kitchen table. He didn't sit. Sitting felt like permission to stop, and stopping felt dangerous. Instead, he busied himself with routine, checking Juniper's water trough, setting hay, washing his hands until the skin tightened. Only when everything else had been done did he return to the table. The envelope lay exactly where he'd left it, its presence quiet but insistent. The paper looked older than Cody, older than Rhett. The ink spelling his name hadn't faded. That alone unsettled him. He slid it open with his pocketknife and unfolded the letter inside. The handwriting was careful, measured, unlike Cody's. Each line seemed to have been placed deliberately, as if the writer had expected the words to carry weight long after he was gone. The letter introduced its author as Elias Wren. Rhett recognized the name immediately, though he'd never met the man. Elias had been their grandfather, his mother's father, spoken of rarely and without warmth. A man who had left Montana decades earlier to live out west, which in family language meant somewhere remote enough to be inconvenient. The letter did not explain why he'd left or why he'd stayed away. It didn't apologize. It simply stated facts. Land owned near the Bitterroot Range, a small ranch abandoned but intact, structures built for weather most people avoided. Elias wrote about wind patterns, snow load, and the danger of short distances in extreme cold. He mentioned a passageway he'd begun to build between the barn and the forge, elevated and roofed, designed to allow safe movement during storms. The project, he wrote, was unfinished. Near the end, the letter shifted tone, not sentimental, but direct in a way that felt personal. Elias acknowledged that if Rhett was reading this, circumstances had likely narrowed. He did not promise comfort or success. He offered access. The land was still legally his. The tools were still there. The work remained. Rhett read the letter twice, then a third time more slowly. When he finished, he folded it back along its creases and sat down at last. The kitchen clock ticked, loud in the silence. Outside, the wind rattled. The siding. Rhett felt a familiar resistance rise in him, the instinct to dismiss the entire thing as impractical, inconvenient, unnecessary. He had work in Missoula. He had obligations. He didn't chase old ghosts, and yet Cody had known about the place. Cody had gone there. Cody, who never kept secrets without a reason. Rhett slept poorly. When morning came, it arrived pale and cold, the sky washed out and uncommitted. He fed Juniper early and noticed her shifting her weight more than usual, favoring her left foreleg. The mare was pushing 25, her coat dulled by age, but her eyes remained sharp. Rhett ran his hand down her leg, feeling heat where there shouldn't be any. By mid-morning, he'd made a decision that surprised him only in how inevitable it felt. He loaded Juniper back into the trailer and drove toward the east side of town, where the veterinary clinic sat near a row of warehouses. The sign out front read, Bitterroot Mobile Vet Services, the paint chipped, but the lettering bold. Inside, the clinic smelled of antiseptic and hay. A woman in her early 30s stood near the counter, her dark hair pulled back into a loose knot that refused to stay neat. She wore worn jeans, a fleece jacket, and boots scuffed with honest use. Her build was lean, her posture relaxed, but her movements were efficient, precise. When she turned, her eyes were alert, quick to assess. This was Mara Quinn. Mara had grown up moving between ranches, the daughter of a farrier who taught her early that animals responded better to calm than force. She'd gone east for veterinary school and come back with a degree and a reputation for practicality. People liked her because she didn't talk down to them and didn't dramatize problems. Animals trusted her because she moved the way they expected a competent creature to move. "Morning," she said, already glancing past Rhett toward the trailer. "What have you got?" "Older mare," Rhett replied. "Left. Foreleg. Heat." Mara nodded once. "Let's take a look." She examined Juniper with steady hands, pressing gently along the joint, watching the mare's reaction. "She's tough," Mara said, "but she's been compensating for a while. Not an emergency. Yet. She'll need rest, careful footing. Cold won't help." Rhett absorbed the words, weighing them. "I might be taking her out of town." Mara raised an eyebrow. "Out where?" "West. Remote." She studied him more closely now, taking in the lines of his face, the tension he wasn't quite hiding. "Remote and winter don't mix well," she said. "Not for old joints." "I know." "Do you?" There was no accusation in her voice, just curiosity. Rhett hesitated, then said, "My brother died yesterday." Mara's expression shifted, subtle but immediate. She didn't reach for sympathy the way some people did. She simply nodded. I'm sorry. He left something, Red added, or pointed me toward it. Mara finished wrapping Juniper's leg and stepped back. If you go, she said, make sure you've got shelter that actually shelters. Wind's worse than cold. Rhett thought of the letter, of Elias's careful descriptions. That's the idea. Mara wrote down instructions and handed them over. If you need help out there, she said, call before you disappear. I do house calls. Even bad roads don't scare me. Rhett gave a brief, dry smile. Good to know. He drove north out of Missoula after noon, following directions copied from county records and old maps. The road narrowed gradually, pavement giving way to cracked asphalt, then gravel. Cell service dropped without ceremony. Forest closed in, dense and indifferent, trees standing close enough that sunlight barely reached the ground. The farther he went, the quieter it became, until even the engine noise felt intrusive. By late afternoon, he found the turnoff Elias had described. It was marked by nothing more than a leaning post, its paint long gone. Rhett hesitated only long enough to shift into lower gear before turning. The ranch revealed itself slowly. First the outline of a barn roof through the trees, then the dark shape of a forge building set apart from the main house. Snow dusted the ground unevenly, the forest already reclaiming what had been left unattended. Rhett parked and shut off the engine. The sudden silence rang in his ears. He stepped out and breathed in air that smelled of pine and cold water. Juniper shifted in the trailer, snorting softly. Rhett unloaded her carefully. The mare stepped onto the snow and stood still, ears flicking, as if listening for something old. The house was smaller than Rhett expected, built solidly with thick timbers. The windows were intact, clouded but unbroken. Inside, the air was cold but dry. The furniture was sparse and practical. A table, shelves, a wood stove. Everything felt intentional, built. To endure rather than impress. Rhett moved next to the forge, larger and better stocked than the house. Tools hung in careful order along the walls, each with its place. On a workbench sat a folded tarp, and beneath it, partially assembled beams and posts, the beginnings of the passage Elias had described. Rhett stepped outside and looked between the barn and the forge, measuring distance, angle, exposure. It wasn't far. And yet, in weather like this, far enough. As dusk settled, Rhett started a fire in the stove and fed Juniper in the barn. The wind picked up again, testing the structures. Standing between the buildings, Rhett felt it push hard against his side, stealing heat instantly. He understood then what Elias had meant. Distance here was not neutral. It was a risk. Rhett stood there until the cold bit through his jacket, then turned back inside. He didn't know yet whether he would stay. He only knew that Cody had brought him here for a reason, and that whatever waited, ahead would not be gentle, but it might be necessary. Morning came without warmth. Light filtered through the trees in a thin, colorless wash, revealing frost that had settled into every depression of the land. Rhett woke on the narrow bed in the house with his boots still on and his jacket folded under his head, the way men slept when they didn't trust a place yet. For a moment, he didn't know where he was. Then, the smell of cold wood and old iron reached him, and memory aligned itself. Outside, the forest was still, not peaceful, watchful. The kind of quiet that existed because nothing wanted to waste energy. Rhett rose, joints stiff, and fed the stove until it caught. The fire took slowly, reluctant but obedient once coaxed. He stepped out to the barn next, pulling his collar high as the wind cut across the clearing. Juniper stood where he'd left her, head lowered, steam lifting from her coat as she breathed. Overnight frost had clung to her mane, turning the dark strands silver. She shifted her weight carefully when Rhett approached. Easy, he murmured, checking her leg again. The swelling hadn't worsened, but it hadn't eased either. She tolerated his touch, patient in the way old animals were when they understood pain as a constant rather than a crisis. Rhett worked through the morning deliberately. He inventoried the house first, then the forge. Elias Wren's presence was everywhere, not as memory but as intent. Tools were arranged by frequency of use, nails sorted by length, boards stacked not by size alone but by grain and density. This wasn't hoarding, it was preparation. By midday, the wind strengthened. Rhett stood between the barn and the forge again, measuring the space not with a tape but with his body. 25 steps. On calm ground, nothing. In wind like this, it became an argument. He leaned into it and felt the cold strip heat from his face almost instantly. Elias had been right. Distance here demanded respect. Rhett returned to the forge and rolled out the old drawings he'd found the night before. The passageway wasn't designed for comfort. The roof pitch was steep enough to shed snow, but low enough to resist uplift. The walls were layered slats, overlapping, breaking the wind rather than blocking it outright. The structure was meant to move slightly under pressure, not fight it. Rhett traced the lines with his finger, understanding the logic immediately. Whoever built this had known the land and accepted its terms. He was studying the drawings when he heard the sound, soft, rhythmic, not quite right. Footsteps. Not heavy, not careless. Rhett turned toward the open forge door, one hand instinctively settling near the handle of the hammer on the bench. A man stood at the edge of the clearing, keeping his distance. He was tall and spare, with narrow shoulders and long limbs that made him look unfinished, like a fence post before it was cut down to size. His beard was patchy and gray-flecked, grown more from neglect than age. He wore a heavy coat that had once been green and a knit cap pulled low over sharp, watchful eyes. "Didn't mean to startle you," the man said. His voice was quiet, roughened by years of cold air. "Saw smoke. Figured someone was alive." Rhett studied him for a beat before lowering his hand. "You live nearby?" "Couple miles east," the man replied. "Name's Tom Ellery." Ellery moved the way people did when they'd learned the cost of sudden gestures. Rhett noted the stiffness in his left leg, the way his weight favored the right. An old injury, poorly healed, the kind that stayed with you. "I'm Rhett," he said. Ellery nodded once. "Didn't think anyone had been out here in years. Place was Elias Wren's, wasn't it?" "It was." Ellery's mouth tightened briefly. "Hard man. Smart, though. Built things to last. Didn't trust people much." Rhett didn't argue. "I'm fixing up." Ellery's gaze drifted toward the barn. "Horse yours?" "Family," Ellery hummed. "Winter's early this year. You planning on staying?" Rhett hesitated. "I don't know yet." Ellery accepted that without comment. "Distance between buildings will kill you faster than cold if you're not careful," he said, nodding toward the gap. "Lost a dog that way once." The statement landed quietly. Ellery didn't elaborate, and Rhett didn't ask. Some losses weren't meant for company. Ellery lingered only a few minutes more, offering no help, asking for none. When he left, he did so without ceremony, disappearing back into the trees as if the forest had reclaimed him. The encounter unsettled Rhett more than he expected. It was one thing to be alone by choice, another to be observed. That afternoon, Rhett began clearing snow and debris from the ground where the passage posts would go. The work was physical and grounding. He measured, marked, remeasured. Mistakes here wouldn't be inconvenient. They'd be dangerous. By late afternoon, clouds thickened, and the light dimmed prematurely. Rhett secured what he could and checked the generator Elias had left in a lean-to near the forge. It coughed when he started it, then settled into an uneven rhythm. Not reliable. Not yet. As dusk fell, the wind shifted. It came harder now, angrier, testing every surface. Rhett moved quickly between buildings, feeling the exposure acutely. Each trip sharpened his awareness. He imagined Juniper panicking if he slipped, imagined the forge door torn from its hinges, imagined the distance becoming a sentence rather than a space. That night the temperature dropped sharply. Rhett sat by the stove, eating a simple meal, listening to the forest assert itself. Branches cracked. Something large moved near the edge of the clearing. An elk, maybe, or something else. He didn't look. Looking didn't help. He thought about Missoula, about the steady noise, the illusion of proximity, about Mara's warning and Ellery's quiet. Confirmation. This place didn't forgive assumptions. Before sleeping, Rhett stepped outside one last time. Snow had begun again, fine and dry, driven sideways by the wind. The space between the barn and the forge vanished briefly in white, then reappeared. Rhett stood there, feeling the cold work its way through his layers, and understood that staying here without finishing what Elias had started would not be brave. It would be careless. He went back inside and lay down fully clothed, boots by the bed this time. As sleep took him, the wind continued its steady assault, indifferent to intention. But Rhett Calder no longer mistook indifference for emptiness. This land was speaking. The question was whether he would listen in time. The storm arrived without drama. There was no sudden darkness, no theatrical thunder. Instead, the wind simply changed its tone, deepening from a steady pressure into something more deliberate, as if the mountains had leaned closer to listen. Snow followed soon after, fine, dry grains that slid sideways across the clearing and erased edges. By mid-morning, the space between the barn and the forge no longer looked like distance at all. It looked like exposure. Rhett woke to that sound, the wind testing seams. He sat up slowly, already alert, the habits of long winters settling into place. The fire had burned down to coals, the room cold but not yet hostile. He pulled on his jacket and stepped outside. The air cut sharp and clean, stealing warmth instantly. Snow skittered along the ground like nervous animals. Juniper stood in the barn doorway, head lowered, her breath thick in the air. She watched Rhett approach, ears rotating to track him. Her leg was stiffer this morning. She placed it carefully, testing before committing her weight. Rhett checked her again, his hands moving with practiced gentleness. "You're not wrong," he muttered. "Neither of us planned for this." He fed her, added extra bedding, and closed the barn doors against the wind. The hinges protested but held. Elias hadn't skimped on hardware. Crossing back to the house took effort now. The wind struck Rhett broadside, forcing him to lean forward like a man pushing uphill. Snow stung his cheeks, found its way into his collar. It wasn't far, but it was enough. By the time he reached the door, his fingers had gone numb. Inside, he shook snow from his jacket and stood still for a moment, breathing. The truth settled in without argument. This wasn't a warning storm. It was a reminder. Winter here didn't announce itself politely. It simply arrived and expected competence in return. Rhett spent the next hours preparing, not building yet, but readying himself to build. Hauled lumber into the forge where it would stay dry, sorted fasteners, and checked the generator again. It sputtered twice before catching, its uneven rhythm setting his teeth on edge. He shut it down and made a note to pull it apart later. Machines, like people, rarely failed without giving advance notice. By early afternoon, visibility dropped further. Rhett moved cautiously now, limiting trips between buildings. Each crossing felt like a negotiation with the weather. He caught himself timing his steps, counting seconds exposed, adjusting his breath to conserve heat. Elias's words echoed in his mind, no longer abstract. Distance was not neutral. It demanded payment. A shape appeared at the edge of the clearing just as Rhett returned from the barn. At first, he thought it was snow piling strangely against a stump. Then it moved. Rhett stopped, hand instinctively lifting. The shape resolved into a dog, medium-sized, lean, its coat a mix of black and rust that blended too well, with shadow and snow. The animal stood still, watching him with alert, cautious eyes. One ear was nicked, torn long ago. The tail hung low, not tucked but uncertain. "Easy," Rhett said quietly. The dog didn't retreat. It took a step forward instead, nose lifting to test the air. It was young, maybe 2 years old, but already carried itself with the wariness of something that had learned not to expect kindness. Its ribs were visible beneath the thickening winter coat. Hunger sharpened its attention. Rhett recognized the posture immediately, not aggressive, not tame, a stray that had survived long enough to be selective. He backed slowly toward the forge, keeping his movements deliberate. Inside, he grabbed a scrap of jerky from his pocket, something he'd brought for himself, and held it out at arm's length. The dog hesitated, then advanced in short, careful steps. It snatched the food and retreated just as quickly, chewing while keeping its eyes fixed on Rhett. Snow gathered along its back. "You're not local," Rhett said, more to himself than to the animal. There were no nearby houses close enough to lose a dog like this. The dog finished the jerky and stood there, undecided. Rhett didn't move. After a long moment, the dog turned and vanished back into the trees, leaving only shallow tracks that filled with snow almost immediately. The encounter left Rhett unsettled. Strays didn't wander this close to winter unless they were desperate or displaced. Either way, it meant the season was tightening its grip. As afternoon slipped toward evening, the storm intensified. Snow piled against the barn doors, and the forge roof creaked under accumulating weight. Rhett moved when he had to and stayed put when he didn't. He cooked a simple meal and ate standing, listening to the wind test the structure again and again. By nightfall, the generator failed outright. The lights flickered once and died. Rhett stood in the sudden quiet, heart rate ticking up despite himself. He restarted it, coaxing it back to life, but the effort left him uneasy. If it quit in worse conditions, fixing it would mean crossing that open distance repeatedly. The thought settled heavy in his chest. He slept lightly, waking often to check the stove and listen for changes in the wind. Near dawn, a sharp crack split the air, a branch snapping under snow load. Rhett was on his feet instantly, boots half-laced, scanning through the window. The barn stood, the forge stood, but the sound echoed in his bones. This place did not allow complacency. Morning came gray and colder than before. Rhett stepped outside and immediately felt the difference. The wind had shifted again, funneling directly through the clearing. He tried the crossing to the barn and nearly lost his footing when a gust caught him mid-step. He recovered, but the message was clear. Today, luck was thinner. Inside the barn, Juniper stood restless, stamping once in irritation or discomfort. Rhett calmed her, then leaned his forehead briefly against the wooden wall, eyes closed. He didn't pray. He calculated. By the time he returned to the house, his decision had taken shape, not as resolve but as acceptance. Elias hadn't left this place as a challenge or a test of character. He had left it as a lesson already learned. Rhett could ignore it, could gamble on short-term survival and hope winter relented, or he could commit to the work that had been waiting for him. He reached for the phone mounted near the kitchen counter, the one spot in the house that occasionally caught a faint signal. He waited, then dialed. It rang twice before connecting. "Mara Quinn," came the familiar voice, slightly distorted. "It's Rhett," he said. "I'm at the Wren place." There was a pause. "That was fast." "Winter is faster," Mara exhaled softly. "How's Juniper?" "Managing, but the leg's worse in this cold." "I figured. What do you need?" The directness steadied him. "I'm going to be here longer than planned. I'll need supplies, and help if you're willing." Another pause, longer this time. When Mara spoke again, her tone had shifted, not alarmed, but serious. "Roads will be bad by tomorrow. I can make it today if I leave now." Rhett glanced toward the window, where snow continued to drive sideways. "If you can't, I can," she said. "I'll bring what I can carry." "Thank you." She hesitated. "Rhett, this place isn't forgiving. Don't treat it like a project." "I won't," he said. "I'm treating it like a responsibility." The call ended. Rhett stood there for a moment longer, phone still in his hand. Outside, the wind continued its relentless probing, indifferent to human plans. Rhett pulled on his jacket and stepped back into the storm. He moved to the forge and unrolled Elias's drawings again, weighting the corners against the wind. Snow dusted the paper almost immediately. He brushed it away and began marking the ground where the first post would go. He wasn't building yet. Not today. Today was for choosing. As he worked, he caught sight of movement near the tree line. The dog from before stood watching, half hidden by falling snow. It didn't approach this time. It simply observed, head tilted slightly, as if assessing whether this human was worth tracking. Rhett straightened and met its gaze. "You picked a bad season to wander," he said. The dog flicked its tail once and remained where it was. Rhett returned to his markings, the decision now fully formed. Staying here would require more than strength. It would require attention, humility, and the willingness to finish what another man had begun for reasons that now felt painfully clear. When night fell again, the storm showed no sign of easing, but inside the house, with plans laid out and help on the way, Rhett felt something shift. Not confidence, not relief, something steadier, commitment. Mara arrived just after midday, the sound of her engine cutting through the wind before Rhett saw the truck itself. Snow trailed behind her tires in pale arcs as she eased into the clearing, careful not to force the turn. The vehicle was a battered four-wheel drive with a veterinary logo ghosted onto the doors, more honest than pretty. When she stepped out, the wind tugged immediately at her jacket, testing her balance the way it tested everything else in this place. She looked smaller out here than she had in town, but not fragile. Her movements were efficient, deliberate, shaped by years of working around animals that outweighed her by hundreds of pounds. Her dark hair was braided tightly now, tucked into her collar. Her face, pale from the cold, held a focused calm that made her seem older than her early 30s. "You weren't exaggerating," she said, raising her voice slightly over the wind. "This place doesn't waste time." Rhett nodded. "Neither do storms." They unloaded supplies together, Fuel, medical gear, feed supplements, insulated tarps. Mara worked quickly, glancing often toward the barn and then the sky, tracking variables the way professionals did without announcing it. Inside the barn, Juniper greeted Mara with a low, familiar huff. The mare shifted, wary but not resistant, her dark eyes watching closely as Mara approached. Mara ran her hands along Juniper's neck, murmuring something too soft to catch, and the horse relaxed incrementally, weight settling. "She remembers me," Mara said, "or remembers my hands. That's enough." She examined the leg again, her expression tightening slightly. "Cold's aggravating it, not infected, but she'll need limited movement, and footing that won't slip." Rhett exhaled. "That's the problem." Mara followed his gaze out the barn doors, where snow whipped across the open ground. "I saw the frame," she said. "The passage. Unfinished. For now." They moved to the forge next, where Rhett laid out Elias's drawings on the workbench. Mara studied them closely, brow furrowing in concentration. She wasn't a builder, but she understood systems, how one weakness cascaded into another. "This wasn't meant to be comfortable," she said. "It was meant to be predictable." "That's how Elias thought," Rhett replied. Mara glanced at him. "And you?" Rhett hesitated. "I think unpredictability kills faster than cold." She smiled briefly. "Good answer." They worked until late afternoon, not building yet, but preparing with intent. Rhett set posts in the ground where the frost hadn't yet locked the soil completely, driving them deep, measuring twice, adjusting angles by eye and instinct. Mara assisted where she could, hauling lighter materials, holding board steady, handing him tools before he asked. They didn't talk much. There was no need. As daylight thinned, movement near the tree line caught Mara's attention. The dog emerged cautiously, the same lean shape Rhett had seen the day before. Snow clung to its coat, and it held itself with that careful neutrality of an animal that had learned not to assume. Mara stilled. "Is that yours?" "No," Rhett said. "Showed up yesterday." Mara crouched slightly, lowering her profile. "Hey there," she said softly. The dog didn't approach, but it didn't flee either. Its ears flicked forward, nose working the air. Hunger sharpened its focus, but fear kept it at a distance. "Probably dumped," Mara said quietly. "People do that when winter scares them." Rhett felt a familiar irritation rise, directed less at the dog than at the thought of abandonment. "Won't last long out here on its own." Mara nodded. "It's already learned to be cautious. That helps." They left a bowl of water and a small pile of food near the forge wall, not close enough to trap the animal, not far enough to be ignored. The pet dog watched from the trees, tail low but not tucked. Night fell hard. The storm didn't intensify, but it didn't loosen either. Snow continued to fall in steady sheets, and the wind kept its relentless pressure. Inside the house, Mara helped Rhett reinforce the door seals with spare insulation. The generator coughed again when they tested it. "That's not going to hold," Mara said. "I know," Rhett replied. "I'll tear it down tomorrow." "If weather lets you." Rhett met her gaze. Weather never asks permission. They slept in shifts that night. Mara insisted, and Rhett didn't argue. She took the first watch, sitting near the stove with a book she didn't read, listening for changes in the wind, for the generator's rhythm faltering. Rhett slept heavily for a few hours, exhaustion pulling him under without negotiation. He woke to Mara shaking his shoulder gently. "Generator's out," she said, stove still holding. Rhett was on his feet, instantly. He pulled on his jacket and stepped outside into a darkness thick with snow. The wind slammed into him, forcing the breath from his lungs. He reached the lean-to in seconds that felt like minutes, fingers numb by the time he got the generator open. The repair was clumsy in the cold. Metal burned his skin. Bolts resisted. He swore once under his breath, then forced himself to slow down. Panic wasted energy. He got the machine running again, but it sounded worse than before. When he returned to the house, Mara was waiting, eyes scanning his face. "That can't keep happening," she said. "It won't," Rhett replied. "Not once the passage is up." Morning came gray and brittle. Snow had piled deep enough overnight to alter the shape of the clearing, filling low spots, hiding uneven ground. The dog lay curled near the forge wall, closer now, its ribs less visible beneath the snow-dusted coat. It lifted its head when Rhett approached, eyes tracking every movement. "You're stubborn," Rhett said. The dog's tail thumped once, cautious but hopeful. They named it nothing yet. Naming felt like a promise. The day became a study in effort. Rhett began actual construction, setting the first beams that would anchor the passage. The work was heavy, slow, and unforgiving. Each measurement mattered. Each joint had to account for wind load and shifting snow. Mara assisted when she could, but much of the labor fell to Rhett. His shoulders burned. His hands cracked despite gloves. He welcomed the pain. It kept him present. By afternoon, the first section stood, a skeleton of intent rising between the barn and the forge. It wasn't shelter yet, but it was direction. Juniper watched from the barn doorway, ears pricked. When Rhett finished for the day, he led her carefully a few steps along the packed snow, testing her footing. She moved slowly, but without panic, progress, however small. That evening, they sat by the stove, exhaustion settling in. Layers. Mara poured hot water over dried herbs and handed Rhett a mug. "For circulation," she said. "Don't argue." He didn't. The warmth spread gradually, easing the ache in his hands. "You didn't have to come," he said quietly. Mara looked at the fire. "You didn't have to stay." They shared a brief, tired smile. Outside, the dog paced once, then lay down closer to the house, trusting the heat leaking through the walls. Rhett stared into the flames, thinking of Cody, of Elias, of the line of decisions that had brought him here. None of it felt heroic. It felt necessary. When he went to bed that night, the wind still pressed hard against the structures, but something had changed. There was now a beginning between the buildings, a line drawn not against winter, but through it. The storm did not break. It adjusted. Overnight, the wind shifted again, no longer striking the buildings head-on, but circling them, probing for weaknesses with patient intent. Snow compacted under its own weight, turning soft drifts into uneven crusts that hid ice beneath. Morning revealed a landscape subtly altered, as if the land had rearranged itself while no one was looking. Rhett woke before dawn, muscles aching in the deep, persistent way that meant the work from the day before had settled into his bones. He lay still for a moment, listening. The stove hummed quietly, steady. The generator's uneven rhythm carried faintly through the walls. It was running. For now. That small fact mattered more than comfort. Mara was already up. He found her in the kitchen, sleeves rolled, hair pulled back again, studying a hand-drawn list she'd made the night before. Her face looked drawn but focused, eyes clear despite the short sleep. She had the look of someone who understood limits and worked within them rather than pretending they didn't exist. "The dog stayed," she said without looking up. Rhett glanced toward the window. The stray lay curled beneath the overhang near the door, its body tucked tight, tail wrapped around its nose. Snow had gathered along its back without waking it. "Smart," Rhett said. "Knows where the heat leaks." Mara nodded. "I checked its paws. No cracks yet. It's young enough to bounce back if it eats." They didn't discuss ownership. Neither of them was ready to make that decision. Out here, promises had consequences. By full light, Rhett was back at the passage frame. The first beams he'd set the day before stood firm, but the work ahead demanded more precision than brute strength. He moved carefully now, aligning supports, adjusting angles by fractions rather than inches. Each placement accounted for snow load, for wind direction, for the slight give the structure would need if it were to survive instead of snap. Mara assisted where she could, holding boards steady, passing tools, keeping an eye on Juniper from a distance. The mare remained restless, shifting often, discomfort evident but controlled. Rhett shortened her lead and patted the ground near the barn entrance, reducing the distance she needed to move. Near midday, the sound of an engine reached them, faint at first, then unmistakable. Rhett straightened, every sense alert. Vehicles didn't pass through here by accident. Tom Ellery emerged from the trees a few minutes later, his truck creeping into the clearing with deliberate care. He stepped out slowly, favoring his injured leg as always. Up close, the years showed more clearly, weathered skin, deep lines around the eyes, hands scarred and thickened from work done without gloves long after it had stopped being wise. "Figured you'd still be alive," Ellery said, eyeing the partially built structure. "Barely." Rhett wiped his hands on his jacket. "Weather let day in. You through?" Ellery shrugged. "Weather doesn't let. It tolerates." His gaze moved from the passage frame to Juniper, then to the dog sleeping near the house. "You collect strays now?" "Seems like they find me," Rhett replied. Ellery grunted. "That's how it starts." He walked closer to the frame, examining the joints, the spacing. He didn't touch anything, but his eyes followed the lines with practiced understanding. "Elias had it right," he said after a moment. "Most folks build to keep weather out. He built to move through it." "That what you'd have done?" Mara asked. Ellery turned to her. He hadn't met her yet. "If I'd been smarter younger, yes." Mara met his gaze evenly. "And now?" "Now I live with what I didn't finish." There was no bitterness in his voice, just statement. Rhett recognized it. The tone of a man who had learned not to argue with his past. Ellery pointed toward the lower end of the passage. "You'll need extra bracing there. Wind'll curl under and lift if you don't break it." Rhett nodded. "I was thinking the same." Ellery hesitated, then said, "I've got some scrap metal. Old but sound. Could help." Rhett considered, then nodded once. "I'd appreciate it." Ellery gave a brief satisfied grunt. "I'll be back before dark." He left as quietly as he'd arrived, his truck disappearing back into the trees. Mara watched him go. "He doesn't waste words," she said. "Neither does winter," Rhett replied. The afternoon dragged under a low sky. Snow fell intermittently now, lighter but persistent, coating everything with a thin, deceptive layer. Rhett worked until his hands shook, then forced himself to stop. Pushing past fatigue here didn't earn respect. It earned mistakes. Inside the forge, he disassembled the generator while Mara checked Juniper again. The machine was worse than he'd hoped. A cracked fuel line, brittle from age, it says, and cold, wept slowly when pressurized. "That's not something you patch," Mara said, peering over his shoulder. "No," Rhett agreed. "That's something you replace." "And you don't have a replacement?" Rhett straightened slowly. "Not yet." Silence stretched. Outside, the wind picked up again. Mara folded her arms. "We need redundancy." Rhett nodded. He'd already reached the same conclusion. "Stove solid. Passage will reduce exposure. Generator becomes backup, not lifeline." "And fuel?" "Enough for emergencies, not comfort." Mara accepted that. "Good." As dusk approached, the dog grew bolder. It approached the forge doorway cautiously, head low, tail wagging once, uncertain. Rhett set down his tools and crouched, making himself smaller. "You can come closer," he said. The dog hesitated, then crossed the threshold. Up close, it was lean but well-proportioned, its coat thickening as winter tightened. Its eyes were amber, alert, carrying the wariness of something that had learned to watch hands as much as faces. Mara knelt nearby. "Male," she said quietly. "Young. Maybe a year and a half." The dog sniffed Rhett's gloves, then sat abruptly, as if surprised by its own decision. Its tail thumped the ground once. Rhett exhaled slowly. "All right," he said. "We'll see." They didn't name him. Not yet. Night fell early. The temperature dropped sharply again, and the wind began to howl in earnest, a sustained force rather than a series of gusts. Rhett and Mara moved supplies closer to the house, anticipating limited movement. When Rhett stepped outside to secure the forge door one last time, the wind caught him hard enough to stagger him sideways. He recovered, but the message was unmistakable. This storm intended to stay. Inside, they ate in silence, each conserving energy. The dog lay near the stove now, close enough to feel warmth, but not so close as to intrude. Juniper shifted into the barn, restless but contained. Sometime after midnight, a sound cut through the wind, metal scraping, followed by a dull thud. Rhett was awake instantly. He grabbed his jacket and stepped outside without thinking. The world had narrowed to motion and noise. Snow drove sideways, stinging exposed skin. Rhett made it halfway to the forge before a gust slammed into him, stealing his footing. He went down hard, the breath driven from his lungs. Pain flared along his ribs. Mara's voice cut through the storm. "Rhett, stay down!" He saw her at the doorway, silhouetted against light. She moved quickly, efficiently, dragging a length of rope behind her. She secured it around his waist with practiced hands, anchoring the other end to the doorframe. "Now move," she said. With the rope holding him against the wind's pull, Rhett made it the rest of the way. The forge door had blown partially open, one hinge strained. He forced it shut, reinforced it with a beam, and tied it off. The work was clumsy, cold-numbed, but effective. They returned to the house shaken and silent. Inside, Mara checked Rhett's ribs quickly. Bruised, not broken. "That could have gone worse," she said. "I know." They sat by the stove until their breathing slowed. Outside, the storm raged on, unbothered by their near miss. Rhett stared into the fire, the word nearly repeating in his mind. Nearly hurt, nearly stranded, nearly careless enough to cost more than he could afford. When morning finally came, it arrived bruised and dim. The storm had not ended, but it had eased enough to reveal what it had done. Snow lay deep and hard-packed. The forge stood. The barn stood. The first section of the passage stood as well, dusted but intact. Ellery returned before noon, bringing the promised scrap metal. He took one look at Rhett's face and nodded. "Storm got close," he said. "Close enough," Rhett replied. They worked together then, the three of them. Rhett, Mara, and Ellery, adding bracing, reinforcing joints, shaping metal to serve wood. Words were few. Purpose carried the rest. By evening, the passage had gained weight and intention. It was still incomplete, still vulnerable, but no longer tentative. As darkness settled again, Rhett stood between the barn and the forge, looking at what now connected them, however partially. The distance had not changed, but how he faced it had, nearly was no longer acceptable. The storm didn't leave all at once. It loosened its grip the way a hand loosens from a throat, not out of mercy, but because pressure had already done its work. By morning, the wind no longer screamed. It spoke in long, hoarse breaths that moved through the trees and worried the edges of the clearing. Snow still fell, but with less intent, settling instead of attacking. Rhett woke sore in places he hadn't known could ache. The bruise along his ribs had deepened to a dark, spreading stain, and each breath carried a reminder of the night before. He sat up slowly, testing himself, and waited for dizziness that never came. Pain he could work around. Surprise was what killed people out here. Mara was awake, as she had been every morning since arriving, already dressed and moving quietly through the house. She had the calm efficiency of someone who had learned long ago that panic wasted time. Her face looked tired now, but her eyes were sharp. "You're stiff," she said, not looking at him. "I noticed." She handed him a mug of hot water steeped with herbs that smelled faintly bitter. "Drink. Then we look at what the storm left us." Outside, the clearing bore the marks of the night. Drifts had reshaped themselves into ridges. One corner of the barn roof sagged under accumulated weight, not enough to fail, but enough to demand attention. The forge door held, thanks to the reinforcement. And between the two buildings, the partially completed passage stood, coated in snow, edges softened, but unmistakably upright. Rhett walked its length slowly, boots crunching on packed snow, one hand trailing along the nearest support post. The structure had flexed in the wind. That was clear from the way snow had shed unevenly from the roof beams. But it had not shifted. Elias's design had held, even in its unfinished state. "That's promising," Mara said quietly. "Promising doesn't keep you alive," Rhett replied, "but it buys you time." They set to work immediately. There was no celebration, no pause to admire. Ellery arrived mid-morning, just as Rhett finished clearing snow from the barn roof. The older man moved carefully, his limp more pronounced in the cold, but his eyes missed little. His beard was rimmed with frost, giving him a look of someone carved from the weather itself. "Looks like it argued well," Ellery said, nodding toward the passage. "It did," Rhett replied. "Now it needs to finish the argument." Ellery climbed out of his truck with more scrap metal and a coil of heavy cable. "Wind'll come back," he said. "It always does." They worked as a unit without discussion. Ellery reinforced the lower braces where the wind curled hardest. Rhett adjusted roof angles, securing overlaps with care that bordered on reverence. Mara moved between them, checking Juniper frequently, then assisting where she could, holding, stabilizing, tightening when extra hands were needed. The dog hovered, nearby throughout the morning, pacing the edges of activity. Its coat was fluffed against the cold now, the black and rust pattern clearer in the daylight. Its ribs were still faintly visible, but less sharply than before. It watched Rhett intently, ears swiveling to track sound and motion. At one point, while Rhett tightened a bolt overhead, the dog barked, a sharp single sound. Rhett froze. A second later, a gust tore through the clearing, strong enough to rock the ladder he stood on. The warning came just in time. Rhett climbed down carefully and crouched in front of the dog. "All right," he said. "I hear you." The dog's tail wagged once, tentative but pleased. Mara watched the exchange. "You might as well name him," she said. "He's already working." Rhett considered the animal, alert, persistent, unwilling to give up ground. "Cal," he said finally, short for nothing in particular. It fit. Cal seemed to accept this with quiet satisfaction. After noon, the passage had changed character. It was no longer a sketch made solid. It was a structure with intent. The roof went on in full sections now, each board overlapped precisely, pitched to shed snow without inviting lift. The walls followed, layered slats spaced carefully to break the wind while allowing air to move. When Rhett stepped inside the partially enclosed corridor for the first time, the difference was immediate. The roar of the wind dulled to a contained force, present but manageable. Mara joined him, her breath fogging less inside than out. She tilted her head, listening. "It works," she said. "It's not done," Rhett replied. "But it works." They didn't linger. The storm had given them a window, and windows closed without warning. Near dusk, Ellery packed up his tools. He stood a moment longer than necessary, looking at the passage. "Elias would have liked this," he said. Rhett glanced at him. "You knew him well?" Ellery's mouth tightened. "Well enough to know he didn't build for praise." He paused, then added, "You're doing right by him. And by yourself." Rhett nodded once. Praise made him uncomfortable. Acknowledgement did not. That night the wind rose again, but differently than before. It tested the passage with long sustained pressure rather than sudden blows. Rhett waited until the worst of it settled, then opened the door and stepped inside the corridor. Snow pressed against the slatted walls and fell away. The roof creaked softly but held. The floor beneath his boots stayed dry. He walked from the house to the forge without breaking stride. Inside the forge, he lit the stove and stood still, letting the significance settle. This was not comfort. This was capability. Mara followed him through the passage shortly after, carrying a lantern. She stopped beside him in the forge and let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "That changes things," she said. "Yes," Rhett agreed. "Now we can move when we need to, not when the weather allows." They slept more deeply that night than they had since arriving. Even the wind seemed to recognize the shift, easing toward morning. The next day brought a brittle clarity. The sky was pale blue, the cold sharp but no longer punishing. Rhett finished the last critical sections, sealing joints, reinforcing the roof edge where drifting snow would accumulate most. By afternoon, the passage stood complete enough to trust. Juniper was the test. Rhett led her slowly from the barn, Cal pacing anxiously at her side. The mare hesitated at the entrance, ears flicking, unfamiliar with the confined space. Rhett rested his hand against her neck, steady and warm. "Easy," he murmured. Juniper stepped forward, tentative but calm. The wind did not strike her. The footing did not slip. They moved together through the corridor, slow but unthreatened. When they reached the forge, Juniper huffed softly and relaxed as if understanding had settled into her bones. Mara smiled despite herself. "She approves." As if on cue, snow began again, light at first, then thickening. Rhett and Mara stood inside the passage, watching it fall without urgency. Cal sat at Rhett's feet, tail curled neatly around his paws. Rhett thought of Cody then, not with the sharp ache that had followed his death, but with a steadier presence. His brother had known about this place, had understood its necessity, had trusted Rhett to finish what he could not. The wind returned in the evening, strong but contained. It pressed against the walls and moved on, denied purchase. Rhett walked the length of the passage once more, listening to its response. It flexed. It held. It answered. For the first time since arriving, winter did not feel like an argument without resolution. It felt manageable. Winter did not end. It settled into routine. Days shortened and lengthened again by degrees too small to celebrate. The cold stayed sharp, but it no longer surprised anyone. Snow fell, melted slightly, then hardened into a layered memory of storms past. The passage between the barn and the forge became ordinary in the way only essential things ever did. No one commented on it anymore. They used it. Rhett moved through it dozens of times a day without thinking, carrying tools, hauling feed, crossing in darkness or daylight with the same steady pace. The wind still pressed against the slatted walls, but it no longer dictated movement. It had been reduced to background, something acknowledged, not feared. That shift changed everything. Juniper improved slowly, not dramatically, not miraculously, but measurably. With the reduced exposure and better footing, the inflammation in her leg eased. She still moved carefully, favoring herself when the cold sharpened, but the constant tension left her body. She slept more deeply now, head low, ears relaxed. Rhett noticed these things the way men noticed weather, without comment, but with relief. Cal became permanent without ceremony. He slept by the door, followed Rhett everywhere, and took his job seriously despite having no formal title. He was leaner than most dogs Rhett had known, built for endurance rather than comfort. His coat thickened fully now, glossy black along the spine, rust-colored at the legs and face. His amber eyes missed little. He rarely barked unless there was reason. When he did, people listened. Mara stayed longer than she'd planned. At first, it was practical. Juniper needed monitoring. The weather made leaving unwise. Then, practicality blurred into routine. She claimed the corner of the table for her notes, set up a small medical kit near the stove, and began helping with tasks that had nothing to do with veterinary care. She learned where Rhett kept his tools. He learned when she needed quiet. They didn't discuss what this was becoming. Labels had never improved outcomes in Rhett's experience. One afternoon, a truck appeared at the edge of the clearing, its engine laboring against the uneven ground. Rhett recognized it before the driver stepped out. The man was broad and thick-necked, his beard dense and trimmed short, his hair hidden beneath a wool cap. He wore a jacket that had once been expensive and now looked well-earned. "County assessor," the man said, offering a gloved hand. "Name's Paul Hendricks." Hendricks was in his early 40s, with the posture of someone who had learned to navigate conflict by standing square and speaking plainly. He'd grown up local, left for a while, and returned when he realized cities didn't suit him. That history sat quietly in the way he looked at land, curious but respectful. "I didn't expect to find anyone out here," Hendricks said, glancing at the passage with interest. "Record said, abandoned." "Not anymore," Rhett replied. Hendricks nodded. "Figured as much when I saw smoke this winter. Folks don't light fires by accident in February." They walked the property together. Hendricks asked direct questions and accepted direct answers. He examined the structures, took measurements, and made notes. When they reached the passage, he paused. "That's smart," he said. "Most people would have just kept running between buildings and hoped." "Hope's expensive," Rhett replied. Hendricks smiled faintly. "You plan on filing the claim?" "Yes." "Good. Land like this disappears if no one says it still matters." The paperwork took weeks. It involved trips to town when the roads allowed, signatures, verifications, and a surprising lack of resistance. The land had not been contested. Elias Wren had been thorough even in absence. When the final document was signed, Rhett felt no triumph. Ownership wasn't relief, it was confirmation. With ownership came neighbors. Not many and not often. But word traveled in places like this. Tom Ellery returned periodically, sometimes with supplies, sometimes with nothing but conversation that didn't require attention. Once, he brought a younger man with him, a quiet ranch hand named Luke Bennett, no more than 25, broad-shouldered and shy, who spoke little and listened carefully. Luke helped reinforce the barn roof and left with a nod and no questions. Spring announced itself without warmth. The snow softened first, its edges rounding, its weight changing. Meltwater swelled the creek Elias had mentioned in his letter, its sound growing louder each day. Birds returned cautiously, testing the silence before committing to song. Rhett noticed these changes without urgency. Preparation had replaced vigilance. Juniper took to the passage as if she'd known it all her life. Cal trotted ahead of her each time, tail high, checking corners that no longer hid danger. Rhett watched them once from the doorway, struck by how normal it all looked. That, more than anything, felt like success. Mara began driving into town again once roads cleared enough to trust. She returned each time, sometimes with supplies, sometimes with stories that felt oddly distant now. One evening, as they sat by the stove, she mentioned she'd been offered a small contract, regular work with a ranch an hour north. "You should take it," Rhett said. She studied him. "You're not worried I won't come back?" Rhett considered. "If you don't, it'll be because you chose not to. I can live with that." Mara smiled then, slow and genuine. "That's the first time anyone's ever said that to me." She took the contract. She also kept coming back. The first real warmth arrived in April, tentative and brief. Snow receded in patches, revealing ground that smelled of earth and old growth. Rhett repaired what winter had worn down, not because it demanded immediate attention, but because neglect had become unacceptable to him. He worked the way Elias had built, anticipating failure, not hoping it away. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, Rhett sat alone in the passage and reread Elias's letter. He didn't skim it this time. He read it as a conversation finally catching up to itself. He understood now why Elias had never finished the passage. Some work waited for the right hands, not because those hands were stronger, but because they were ready. Cal settled beside him, resting his head against Rhett's knee. The dog had gained weight, muscle filling in where hunger once carved him thin. His eyes remained alert, but the edge had softened. "You stayed," Rhett said quietly. Cal's tail thumped once. Later that week, Mara returned from town with news. The small school near the nearest junction was looking for someone to help with facilities maintenance and transport. The position was part-time, flexible, and practical. "You'd be good at it," she said. "They need someone who doesn't panic when things break." Rhett considered the idea longer than he expected. Work had always been something he reacted to, not something he chose. This felt different. "Maybe," he said. By late spring, the land no longer looked paused. It looked lived in. The passage stood between the barn and forge, unremarkable at a glance, essential in function. It had carried them through the worst winter Rhett could remember without asking for bravery, only preparation. One evening, as they sat outside watching the last of the snow retreat into shadow, Mara broke the quiet. "Do you think Cody knew this would happen?" Rhett didn't answer immediately. He watched Juniper graze carefully near the tree line, Cal circling her like a self-appointed guard. "I think he hoped it wouldn't," Rhett said finally. "But he wanted it to be possible." Mara nodded. That answer satisfied her. The wind moved. Through the trees again, softer now, wandering instead of hunting. Rhett listened without tension. He had learned its language. He knew when it meant trouble and when it was simply passing through. The land had not changed. He had. What remained was not the absence of loss, but the presence of continuity. The understanding that survival did not require isolation, only thoughtful connection. Between buildings, between people, between what had been left unfinished and what could still be shaped. Rhett stood and walked the length of the passage once more, hands brushing the familiar grain of the posts. It answered him with silence, which was exactly what he wanted. In short, this story doesn't say that miracles come with thunder or blinding light from the sky. Sometimes, God's miracles come very quietly. They come in the form of a small path built at the right time, a hand appearing when we think we are alone, or a silent strength helping us get up for a new day. God doesn't always dispel the storm, but He often leaves a path through the storm. The same is true in each of our lives. Perhaps you are carrying a loss that no one sees. Perhaps you are struggling for a child, a loved one, or simply to survive the day. If you are still moving forward, however slowly, however shakily, that is not a coincidence. It is grace at work in a very human way. If this story resonates with you, please leave a comment below, share where you're watching, or simply write, "I'm still here." Who knows, your words might be a small miracle for someone reading this. If you believe that no one, especially children or vulnerable people, should face their fears alone, please subscribe to the channel and share this story with those who need hope. May God bless you, give you peace in difficult times, strength when you feel exhausted, and a path, however small, that always leads you home. Amen.